So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Valeriano Ramos with Everyday Democracy, and I want to thank and welcome all of you to this special event, Beyond Election Day, Renewing Our Culture of Civic Engagement. We are proud to have with us author Andrew Sommers, who will be joining us shortly to start this important conversation. Um, but before I introduce our special guest, I want to acknowledge our sponsors. Those are funders who made this event possible. And they are the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and the Connecticut Humanities in partnership with the Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So our thanks to them for the grants that have provided for us opportunities to continue to educate and inform Connecticut residents, including our Connecticut Civic Ambassadors, about the importance of civic engagement for sustaining and strengthening our communities, our civic life, and our democracy. Now that the presidential election is over, depending on how you see it, because we still have the Electoral College votes happening in a couple of weeks, I guess. The question still remains, I think, as to how we can remain civically engaged year-round. And that is what today's conversation is about. What does that look like? How can we continue to remain engaged in ways that will continue to strengthen our democracy and our communities? Before I start, however, I want to very quickly share some housekeeping information. First of all, this event is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube and Facebook, I would say probably sometime next week. We ask that you please keep your videos off and mics muted. Please select speaker view in the upper right-hand corner. And please use the chat feature only to post your questions for our guest speaker. You can post them anytime, but we will be collecting them and sharing them at the end with our guest. And Zoya Ali, who is our colleague, Everyday Democracy, will be the one who will be gathering the questions and sharing them with Mr. Andrew Sommers. I'm sorry. So thank you all for your cooperation and participation. And at this point, I want to introduce our special guest speaker. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Andrew Sommers. Andrew earned a BA from Pennsylvania State University and a master's from the University of Pennsylvania with concentration in economics, business management, and government. He has over a decade of experience, primarily as a management consultant, working with federal agencies, bringing innovation to their businesses and technology programs. Andrew has been an active member of numerous Washington, D.C. nonprofit and civic organizations, most notably as a board member of D.C. Social Innovation Project. And also he's a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. You've heard about the Daughters of the American Revolutions. Now you're meeting someone who is a member of Sons of the American Revolution. When Andrew is not playing with his son, I think you said he's a year and a half or something like that, Andrew?
Yeah, that's right.
A toddler. He's an avid soccer and chess player. And by the way, I'm also a chess player, Andrew. So you and I need to play a game one of these days.
This is a follow-up, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So his new book, Andrew's new book, Engage, A Citizen's Perspective. I can't remember the full title. Can you share that with us, Andrew, the full title of it?
Sure. Well, thanks, Val. It's a pleasure to be here. The book title is Engaged, a Citizen's Perspective on the Future of Civic Life,
yeah.
That I published earlier this year. So thank you.
And exactly, it was just published, I think, in February, right?
That's right, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. And already Andrew has been doing some touring. Well, not physically, virtual touring, I guess. But I do want to thank you, Andrew, for accepting this invitation to be part of this conversation. I think, we're very honored to welcome you here to this event. So thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. That was very nice. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a new author, and it's a topic I care deeply about. And I've come to learn about the good work that you all do, and so thanks for having me. And I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Andrew. And I mentioned that we are about a month away from the 2020 presidential election and are still living with some of its remnants, right? I mentioned the Electoral College. I mentioned, the President Trump's campaign, still challenging some of the results, I guess. This in some way reveals some of the negative side in our political culture. And even though this is important, I'm not going to dwell on it. I think we get enough and a dose of that every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Through Twitter and Facebook and the networks. And so we're not going to talk too much about that. We are going to talk about it from the standpoint of civic engagement, though. So I want to mention that. Now, Andrew, in your book, you talk about building a strong culture of civic engagement, right? That keeps us connected with each other and also connected to our democracy beyond election day, right?
Yeah.
So for some of our audience, though, the term civic engagement may be foreign or not clear. I've seen many different definitions of civic engagement. So perhaps we can start with what I consider to be one of the best definitions that I am familiar with, and that is the one published by Professor of Stanford University, Thomas Ehrlich. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to read it to you, Andrew, and then I will invite your commentary on it. And so I'm going to read it. Civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. And I'm reading this, and as I read your book, Andrew, his definition came to mind. There are clearly some similarities with how you describe it in your book, how you describe civic life as civic engagement. Do you agree? And what are some similarities in the way you present your definition and your thinking and that definition by Professor Ehrlich?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I think just to start, following a recent conversation we had, Val, I actually just purchased a book by Professor Ehrlich because it struck me just to kind of get to know his work a little bit more. But part of the entree into writing this book wasn't, I'm fortunate. I had some great schooling at Penn State. I'm obviously a Pennsylvania person through and through, and University of Pennsylvania. But I didn't come at this to say, hey, what kind of what's right or not right about the way we think about civic engagement. I kind of, part of, to get to your question, but part of the motivations for me were thinking, from kind of 2016 to 2020 about democracy really from a citizen's perspective, right? And about what does it mean to be engaged and why does this stuff matter? And it's kind of, I took a little bit of a management consultant's non-expert perspective to say, okay, what kind of stuff goes into it? Us knowing the world as citizens, and what stuff kind of encompasses this, the ways we participate in our society as citizens, right? And so, but now having written the book and looking at a definition by like this Professor Ehrlich, I find it to be very resonating, right? I both included political and non-political activities, right? So I think that's a notable one. Both a focus.
And you made the distinction. You made the distinction in your book very clearly.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and to the extent, it's hopefully it came through for many readers. But I truly, while I'm politically active, I really tried to step back and kind of make this really about, citizenship, right? Kind of more broadly, rather than a particular kind of political perspective on it. And then Professor Ehrlich's definition also kind of focuses on, kind of that problem solving aspect in the community. Skills. And I think although I didn't break down local versus national in the book, I think that's very much a component and lens that is part there too, right? Civic engagement kind of in some ways, right? All civic engagement is local, but there's also a national component to this as well, which I think is important.
Absolutely.
So, in that respect, I think there's a lot there that that, especially in retrospect, having written this book without kind of having a specific definition of mind that truly resonates. Yeah.
Right, and in your book you mentioned, of course, and we'll talk more about this civics learning. and having civic competence in terms of understanding the ways that you can participate, both civic, in the civic sphere, but also in the political. And so, why is civic engagement so important? What are some of the reasons, Andrew?
Yeah, it was in some sense, I'm sure to many of us on the call, it's obvious, right? I think when I was kind of presented with when I was kind of writing the book, I was kind of thinking about it almost from a perspective like, why does active citizenship matter to democracy in a way?
Yes.
And so I think there's lots of components to why does this stuff matter, right? And I started to see a web of connectedness between a lot of these topics and outcomes that are so important, right? So take voting, for example. We know voting is important. It's the number one characteristic that Americans say of kind of good citizenship. It's voting is at the top. But the things that influence whether or not we will vote, it's not as simple as just,
Correct.
do you know about the election? It's, quality of the civics education. It's kind of, there's, whether or not you kind of pay attention to local news. And, there's a kind of some correlation between public service. And so I found that web to be very, very fascinating. But I think it goes without saying that the benefits of civic engagement, I'd like to say, I mentioned this on another call I did, is, if you're the type of person that kind of likes to view these things through an very individualistic perspective, there's a lot of fascinating research that just says being involved, right, is healthy for us, right?
Personally, that's right.
Personally, right, it's good for us. Depending on the type of activity, it's good for our communities. But I think there's, and Val, you and I have talked about this, I think there's an interesting component to being in proximity to our institutions and the closeness. And, I kind of came at this also from like a social capital and a trust perspective.
Robert Putnam.
Being heavily influenced by Robert Putnam. So, I think, I was kind of after I know the whole, trust thing is a buzz right now. And I was kind of after that question from a little bit of a different perspective. So I think, I think there's benefits there too, right? Active engagement, proximity to kind of our democracy can breed, more positive forms of kind of, patriotic identity, and also more positive forms of kind of trust and so forth, both in each other, but also in our institution. So I think it's a wide range of stuff. Yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Andrew, because, obviously trust is something that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later about institutions like the media and all that. But, it's so important because, even if you look at the whole idea of bridging capital, right? And Robert Putnam talks about that. So it's not about connecting among your own group, but also with others who are different from you, right? Politically and racially and ethnically as well. And so there is a concept called social priming, you might be familiar with, which is one way that people can really have the opportunity to mirror themselves and challenge implicit biases that they may have. They can start identifying those right away, acknowledging those in some way, by being with people who are different from them ethnically and racially, right? Because you might hear about some people of color and all this negative stuff that you, especially if you've grown up living in a white community and never seen people of color, you create these biases. But engaging with them civically gives an opportunity to really see them as human beings, number one, but also as dispelling a lot of those biases that may exist. So there's, as you said earlier, there's some personal values. Yeah, there's personal value to that in terms of also changing your whole mindset about how you see people who are different from you. And you mentioned, we started talking about Robert Putnam, right? But you also in your book mentioned two other great authors and thinkers. One of them, of course, several centuries old, Alexis de Tocqueville, right? Who wrote Democracy in America, the 2 volumes. And the other person, Eric Liu. Can you talk about that and how they influenced your book, or how you saw them, the lens through which you saw their work and what you were trying to do with your book?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of hit on a point you just previously mentioned. For those who were able to kind of read through the book, there's a neighbor of mine who's quite different than from me, and he's a prominent kind of component to the book, and it's it's quite important, right? And we've realized, my wife and I, and kind of live in a very diverse neighborhood, and we've just benefited over the years, and we hope that kind of goes both ways, just of kind of getting to know others who have just very different backgrounds from us.
Exactly.
And that doesn't even have to be active engagement. That's just the manner of kind of getting to know your neighbors and other people close by. So I just thought that was an important point. And Alexis de Tocqueville, I know, gets referenced quite a bit. He's an important,
especially these days, right?
Especially these days. Still always surprised at how many people haven't heard about him, and Eric Liu too. I think, to address Eric Liu first, I think what was very influential with me is I kind of coming at this from a I think a little bit of a pragmatic standpoint, and maybe in a way of kind of like, why does this stuff matter? And I think the thing about Eric Liu, what is rubbed off, is that he has been kind of a writer who has both been able to combine kind of history, understanding of democracy, but then also really some kind of put his work in actionable ways, right? That both inspire and motivate. And I also think too, the other thing about Eric Liu is that he's, Val, you and I've talked about kind of this tapestry of things that influence civic engagement and kind of components to it. And I always found that Eric Liu, while not necessarily using that language, is kind of alluded to this kind of spectrum of activity and things that matter to us as citizens. So I think, and with that, it's kind of bringing the concept of citizenship kind of back to the fore, right? What does that mean? It's not a passive thing. I think having it as an active thing, and I think Eric Liu kind of puts that, in a very central piece. And I think Alexis de Tocqueville, I mean, goodness, democracy in America is a big work, right? Admittedly, probably haven't read the whole thing, but there are, I think what's fascinating, probably the reason why he gets brought up, is just that day and age is just so distant from where we are today, yet in some ways, some of the things he wrote are just so relevant. And I think it's being able to kind of both draw a line and see that some of the things, even so, for how different and kind of immature the country was in some ways back then, some of the things that he drew out, but they're very relevant today. And I think he was kind of, I don't think he used this term, but the other way I've been kind of thinking about engagement is kind of like the culture of our democracy.
The culture, correct.
Of our democracy, right? Exactly. And I think, it was de Tocqueville who really wrote about these things that are important kind of pieces of glue to that culture. Everything from newspapers to,
civic
associations and all that stuff. And those are important. And I think sometimes those are at distance to when we talk about democracy, and he kind of put them on the same level as a lot of other kind of aspects of our democracy too.
Right, and he talks about those free associations as opportunities for people to really invest themselves in something that benefits the society and the community in general, right? And of course, we can make some arguments that some of those free associations, especially those that we have now, might sometimes work against democracy, like some political PACs. And
that's right.
But that's democracy.
The mother of all knowledge, I think.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Andrew. I think those are really good insights. And you mentioned the tapestry of civic engagement, and you address all these different ways in your book. You mentioned, for example, the Women's March and the environmental movement, right, and other forms of collective voice.
Yeah.
And of course, they're all different in terms of the organizing part, the pieces that come with organizing these kinds of groups of people working together and advancing a cause or a vision that they have. Do you consider community organizing and mass movements and marches such as Black Lives Matter or Women's March, etc., civic engagement? And if so, in what ways do they contribute to strengthening our civic culture and democracy?
Yeah, well, first of all, absolutely right, and without both without hesitation, and I also, kind of maybe to my a little bit to my detriment, kind of really brought in this definition of engagement quite a bit. But I think, to bring it back, one of the themes of the book, and I think one of the things I sought to investigate was, we tend to, at least as a country, get a little bit more engaged and pay a little bit more attention just on, right now during big presidential kind of elections, right? So we just had one. We had a lot of voter participation, which is wonderful, and we can talk about the springboard
Yep.
that we're working off of now. And even that participation was never, historically, that amazing. But I was also kind of thinking about, the state and local participation, which pales in consideration to the 50 or 60% we might get
Correct.
who come out for presidential elections. And so there was always this question in the back of my mind of what does good look like, and how do we sustain
Yes.
kind of people's desires and interest to participate, if you will, right, in this democracy, or know how to, not just every 4 years, right, kind of in between. And so, when we're talking about like mass movements and, marches, and my wife and I've lived here in Washington, D.C. for 10 years. And so we've both participated in some of those, and have witnessed many of them too. And I think, I think it's interesting to draw on, some of former President Obama's kind of wisdom here. And that is, the more I wrote the book, the more it kind of became apparent that a lot of sometimes high visibility forms of engagement, while they're so important, they represent kind of key milestones and kind of dots on the map, but they don't fill everything in between. And so I think the more we can get, all excited around a continual conception of kind of living democracy, right? And in the spirit of your organization, right, everyday democracy. I think I think there's a lot in the book that tries to kind of push that. In addition, but absolutely, those are important forums, and as many say, right, they raise awareness to issues, sometimes publicly or nationally. But we have to make sure that we equip both kind of equip others and our whole country, right, to know how to translate those kind of important events. So
I like the way you're framing it, because you and I talked a little bit about this, and you mentioned that one of the key elements of civic engagement is bringing about change, right, and for the better of the community, or the better, and it goes with Ehrlich's definition. And of course, these mass movements, and sometimes people forget that the suffrage movement, right?
Yeah.
Women were not able to vote until it was in 1920, or I think 1920. But there was an entire generation of women, if not more than one, that marched in the streets, that engaged in all kinds of collective voice and demonstrations, and many of them were arrested, beaten. And it also reminds us of the civil rights movement, right? The anti-war movement. But you see that a lot of things came out of that. Of course, the 1920 suffrage opportunities for women to vote, and then the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. So I agree with you. I think that there's that connection with policy and with change has to be part of it too.
Yeah, and just so it wasn't in the book, and but I think the late Congressman John Lewis, who I think, I hope I don't mess this up, but it said something to the effect of, democracy is not a thing; it's something we do, right?
Exactly.
And I think there's also as part of my hope was to kind of get people to kind of re-inspire themselves around that concept of citizenship.
Right.
I also think there's also a shift in doing kind of moving towards sustained engagement is also having a kind of an eye towards more longer term thinking. We live and it's hard, right? We live in a society where there's so much just on quarterly earnings and short term, next elections and all that stuff. And I think those the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement and all those, they in some cases, they took a lot of time, and that's in some ways it's just that they did, but but we have to just, kind of remember that there's, long-term thinking can really play a practical role. And it's hard when, we need to kind of remind ourselves that, right? So.
Absolutely. Yes. And now that you mentioned voting, and of course, I'm not going to talk about certain things about voting because that we see enough of that on television. But you mentioned about the level of participation, right? That we saw that in 2008 with President Obama's campaign. He was able to activate young people, a lot of young people, people of color, and so on. And in this year, this presidential election, in your book, you mentioned that in 2016 there were like 67 million eligible citizens who didn't vote.
Yeah.
In 2016, right? And I did the calculation, and right now we have over 154 million people voted, right?
Yeah.
And that was 26 to 27 million more than in 2016. And so obviously something happened, right? And can you talk about what you think can account for that? Was it only that people were voting by absentee, or the polarization in our society? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I have both kind of a concern and an optimistic, I think, perspective on this. But I, so I think you're right. I don't know exactly kind of where the final kind of voter participation rate is going to shuffle out here in 2020. But it just struck me when I was writing this that sometimes we get, Eric Liu is the first one to tell you, right? Imagine what 100% participation looks like. And when you just look at numbers, you can't help but think, well, this candidate got that and this candidate got that. And there's all these people that could have actually introduced another candidate to change. And it's just staggering, right? So there's a need. Obviously that went up. And I think the opportunity here is that there's a springboard, right? And we'll kind of talk opportunity first. And I think, there was, so I spent quite a bit of time this election cycle, both kind of participating in other forms of engagement too, phone baking, canvassing. It was different this year because of a pandemic, and there's potentially a story or two I'd like to share there. But I think, I think the opportunities are a lot of, I do think in some respects, right, because of all the people that voted by mail, that they're whether or not we sustain that, I think what it pointed to was that, hey, look, we make it hard for people to vote. So when you actually kind of make it a little bit easier, you get more participation.
You see what happens, exactly.
And so
common sense.
It's right. And so I think there's a, hey, look, right, there's a Pew Pew fact here that just like, look at the country believes that voting is even more important than following the law, right? Strangely, right? I know that may sound weird, but and we owe it to ourselves to make it to make it easy, right? For ourselves to do that. And I think this election cycle, partly because of the pandemic, we got more people voting by mail, and we saw participation came up. Now, I think not just that, but I think we also saw a lot of other non-voting participation. Anecdotally, I saw this a lot too. People being kind of poll observers and, volunteering for other, not just campaign work, but maybe canvassing and other sorts of stuff. And I think that's really great. And I think not to be, kind of concerning about this. I think the concern is though that a lot of people are exhausted right now, I think, from politics.
Drained out.
And I think the concern was that sometimes in politics, we candidates can say, well, this is the most important election. You have to come out just this one time. And I think we got to flip this on this head. Say, we should all come out this much all the time, right?
That's right.
It's not yes, it was an important election, right? And people get that. But I think the concern is that, the springboard kind of gets lost and gets dropped off. The hope is that when others participate outside of just voting, right? So I think there's hey, what can we learn about getting more people to vote from this election? And notably vote by mail. And there's some states that just do this much better than others. But I think there's some people that had genuinely more positive experiences by going out and maybe knocking on doors and feeling like they contributed and or picked up the phone. And we have to I guess be prepared to kind of translate that more into a habit than a once in a
Yes,
lifetime type
exactly.
activity. So
And absolutely. And one thing we saw, Sandy and I and Richard Creeder, we work with Hartford Votes Coalition. We have other members of the coalition here participating. We saw people doing all kinds of things. We have a group of young people called the Hartford Voters Youth Corps. And they actually went to the lines when people were voting. Some people voted at the polls.
Yeah.
They provided them with, I forgot what they exactly what they did, but they helped them through the experience, and were there to support them. And of course, those are some ways that, and people volunteering, young people volunteering at the polls as poll workers, because in Connecticut, most of the poll workers are older people who were more likely to be infected by COVID and have serious consequences. And these young people, and there's a couple of people on this event, like Sandy, for example, also was a poll worker. So the other side of it, though, is important that you mention it, the local piece, because we find in Connecticut and in Hartford, for example, we've had very low voter turnout for local municipal elections, right? As low as 25%. And most recently 30%. And so that's another area that we need to emphasize to our civic ambassadors and other people, that voting should not only be during a presidential election or even midterms. You also want to be actively engaged in local municipal elections, because that's where the decisions that impact you the most are happening. You have any comments? Any comments on that, Andrew?
Yeah, can I? And if I could just add a quick
Sure.
anecdote from just kind of been imprinted on my mind from the last couple months. If I, and not to suggest that I'm gonna write another book here, but if I had to pick up and kind of pick up from the book, there's a short chapter on kind of civic blue zones, and I take that from kind of from a health standpoint, but I think what's interesting is there's all these places, right, both in the country, and if you want to broaden out the scope across the world, where participation is working really well. And I'm really fascinated by what can we learn from places that may keep up high voting rates, right? What are some of the things they're doing? And I happen to make a call, so just to that point, right, I was phone banking, and I spoke with a woman from, I believe, Kane County, Pennsylvania, and from a really small town, just a couple thousand people. And she was one of the most delightful people. First of all, for people phone bank before, you usually don't even get many people who will talk to you. And she talked to me for about 10, 15 minutes. And she was explaining to me that she's an election official in her town or municipality. And she said they pride themselves on, within their town, a really high kind of voting rate. And she was telling me about this, is what they do is they bring in the children when they're, anywhere from, kind of 5 to 12 years old. And even during kind of non-presidential elections, they just bring them in to show them how it works, right? So here's how, maybe mom and dad kind of have to do to show up at the polls, and here's how they vote. Maybe they do a mock thing. And I'm not suggesting we scale that, but I think there are places where, we do innovative things that may just seem, kind of commonplace to others, that have rubbed off and have been so important. So, those sort of things that excite me and encourage me. And I think if we could, the types of things that if you could adopt over time, they pay off, and
they become civic habits.
Habits, right? And then it becomes that, okay, well, voting is not just once every 4 years.
Exactly.
Hey, look, we have another one this, we do it, right? And and I think that's important. So.
That's great. And Eric Lou talked about the joy of voting, right? How people celebrated historically in the past. We celebrated voting, and that's something that we encourage you to, those of you who are here, to read Eric Lou's books. He talks a lot about the history of voting and all that. And so I should mention also the Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, who is a member of the Connecticut Civic Health Advisory Group. She co-chairs the group. She is advancing legislation with a group of legislators to make voting in Connecticut no excuse absentee voting for those who want to avail themselves of that. So that's a positive development, I think, came from the experience of what happened in this election with the pandemic, and that the turnout was amazing. We still have to wait for the final data, but we are all very convinced that it was a very successful year in terms of actual turnout, especially young voters included, and other people as well. And so, but
Yeah.
you started touching on something here, Andrew, civic learning. You talk about the children, bringing the children to the polls, right? And in your chapter 2, you talk about civics learning, and you share some perspectives on your own personal experience with civics learning, of course, back in the day, although you're not that old compared to me, for example. But how also it's important for a stronger civic life, and I touch on that because one of my closest friends and colleagues in the work that we're doing in Connecticut, Mr. Stephen Armstrong, who is the coordinator of social studies at the State Department of Education, has always shared with me how challenging it has become for civics teachers to teach the subject of the presidential election, because it's these past 2 elections have been presidential elections have been so polarized. That's one of the challenges, of course, and you may want to comment on that. But what other challenges do you see that exist in civics education today, and the importance of civic education first, how important is that to our civic life? And then also, what have been the challenges in your opinion?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Val. And maybe just as a context setting point, and I'm going to be speaking with my alma mater next week. I also been kind of coordinating and speaking with some folks from my high school. I'm very fortunate. I consider myself lucky to have gotten such a nice education, and I wrote the chapter, and I almost felt a little bit, you know, like I was a little bit hard on the places that I may have went to, but it was trying to be kind of a fair reflection, just that less about, for me it was kind of just that, hey, this stuff just wasn't, I acknowledge I went to a good school, right, and good places, but this stuff just wasn't emphasized that much, right?
Yeah.
Stuff being civics, and of course I took social studies and history courses, and came out of it kind of having a foundational understanding of the federal government, the 3 branches, and what we do. But I think, when I wrote the book, I kind of had, and I think when I was younger, probably to my detriment, I tended to only, at least when I was in high school, start to think about things very practically. So I was like, this is important stuff, but I didn't really grasp the practical elements of it, and it didn't kind of rub off on me why local government mattered, or my vote in kind of off-year election mattered and all that stuff. But reading this book, right, or excuse me, writing this book, I think civics education, at least there's a couple elements to it, right? There is some kind of correlation with some good information out there that kind of higher quality places that put more emphasis on civics education, higher quality kind of resources behind it, tend to see higher voting rates and other forms of volunteerism and participation. And so and also kind of speaking to kind of people like myself, or a younger version of myself, who may not see the immediate practical applications, we have to kind of re-put on the long-term lens here, that things like civics education may not immediately, quote unquote, kind of pay off in the next 3 months. They matter over a lifetime. Exactly. Right. And so I think from a benefit standpoint, there's you're more likely to get kind of more people who understand and want to participate, because they've maybe thought more, they've been maybe in some ways challenged more critically to think about their civics education. I also and before I answer the second question, I when I was thinking about civics education, there was kind of 2 kind of big questions in my mind. One is, kind of what should we know, right? This is going back to the thinking, if anyone's read Robert Putnam's The Upswing, right? Thinking about the last upswing, where maybe there was a focus on schools that where there was a kind of educating a citizen meant a couple different dedicated courses around civics, not just a broader
just one
social side, right? And so I think there's kind of the question of like, what do we need to impart to make people to make students be a little bit more practical. But the other is, it's kind of the the patriotic kind of national identity kind of question. It's the E.D. Hirsch component to this, and Aspen's looked at what do we all need to do to have some shared understanding. And I think there's there's right now there's room to broaden that, right?
Absolutely.
But also get behind it in a way that can ensure that we're preparing kind of future generations to have kind of a strong concept of what kind of what it means to be American for all the challenges and all the the good and bad there. So I'm sorry, I stayed on that one question. The second part of that was challenges to teaching civics right now.
Yes.
And the one last thing I'd say there just quickly is that I think there's this kind of going to technology and just the digital landscape right now. I don't unfortunately I didn't take the time to kind of sit down with civics teachers. I've talked to some since writing the book, but my guess with the polarization, it kind of goes to the news and media question, is that I think there's a challenge. If I were a civics teacher, I think I'd be challenged by just the kind of what other information have students been exposed to, right? And what does that range of information look like? Because it's a different landscape than it used to be, and I could suspect that that in a national polarizing or a national conversation that's polarizing, it would certainly contribute to challenges of trying to have harder conversations in the classroom.
Exactly, and related to that, also the work that we did here with the Connecticut Civic Health Project there was a recognition by the Civic Health Advisory Group that for inner city schools and children in those school districts, they had less opportunity, in some cases no opportunity, or very little opportunity to really benefit from civics learning and curriculum and materials and support, because the focus was on the content areas, math, reading, and so on. But I raised this question also because we have two great people here attending this event. I mentioned Steve Armstrong, right, the coordinator of social studies, who is a member of the Civic Health Advisory Group, a good friend, but also Steve Masegara, who is from the Lufra Institute. And they too have been very engaged in promoting the 4 Cs, right? Is it the 4 Cs or the 3 Cs? I forget. 3 Cs?
It seems to be fair. I hope I don't get it wrong.
Sometimes but the curriculum that reinforces the importance of civics learning, not only to be an effective citizen, but also in terms of your future life and how you contribute and your career and so on. And so, this is an important topic because, of course, you mentioned the studies that show that those who've got better experience, a richer kind of civics education, have been more actively engaged, not only in the political process, but also in other ways. So there's a lot of great stuff happening around action civics or hands-on civics, which I think hopefully will continue to advance that goal of promoting a citizenry, quote unquote, that is informed. And again, that's part of your definition and also the definition of Ehrlich of being learning the skills, right, and the abilities. But let me now we're getting close to the end. I just want to make sure we don't run over too long because we want to have the audience opportunity to ask questions. So in the last chapter, you talked about what we need to do individually and collectively, right, to renew our culture of civic engagement. And so I wanted to know if you could just share some thoughts on that, but also what are some of the skills that we need to cultivate, especially among young people, but anyone in particular, in general, to be more effective agents of civic change.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And I think I may not have put it explicitly in the book like this, but to me, there's a theme in that last chapter, going back to an earlier point about proximity to our democracy, right? And I think there's from a social capital standpoint, right, when we are kind of at distance, to participating in our communities, right, participating in our non-political or political processes, it can have negative effects on us, and the benefits of being closer to, right? So when we think about trust and other important outcomes that and I'll just say this too, the other kind of aspect that struck me is that there's which I think goes to the civic engagement question too, is many Americans, while at least pre-pandemic, employment may have been low and there may have been some good economic information. Many Americans on both kind of all political persuasions, evidence that they don't have a really kind of a favorable view of the future, right? And what that future is for their young kids. And I think there's something there in what it means to kind of have this collective vision. I think civic engagement is kind of a piece of that, right?
Yes.
And so the theme of that last chapter, and this is why, I know it's not a catch-all solution. The last chapter is not everything that's going to address kind of making democracy better. It's very much a citizen-centric one, but I think that's why there's both a kind of a national and a individual perspective on this. Is that I would love to see some of our representatives and some of our leaders, kind of talk a little bit more about things like civic engagement, right, and the importance of that active engagement, what it means to our democracy and our politics and all that stuff. And I think having that can be a glue that can help. We're in a time of distrust right now, right? And I think that can be important, right? I think as individuals, it's a part of it is I think for us kind of reevaluating our even though this is hard right now because we're in a pandemic. I do firmly believe that even though our technology is getting better, that there is a kind of there's a point that we have to work on around our use of digital technologies, right? And I like to take a diet metaphor, right? Those are not the main dish, but maybe kind of stuff we use on the side. And I think we really need to just a theme here, right? And I know I'm being a little non-specific for those who read that last chapter, but a theme of just thinking of ourselves as citizens, right? And kind of reclaiming that a little bit. So again, kind of proximity, kind of thinking about, the type of, kind of good work and how we do that work, right, between elections and equipping people to do that. And so, part of that is just, I mentioned, Val, the Listen First Project and the National Conversation Project. I was speaking with them about this a little bit. And one of the takeaways, at least from kind of a public discussion standpoint, and goes into my last chapter, is yes, be political, talk to people about politics, but have a longer term view in mind, right? You're not going to change someone's mind right away.
Exactly.
And think about the health of the relationship and the health of with a longer term view in mind. We're malleable, right? We can change. And I think it's trying to do these things with a good long-term intent in mind. So,
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Andrew, because I was going to ask you the question. I thought maybe I was being a dreamer. That it sounds to me like civic engagement is a way to bridge divides. As we talked earlier, building trust, building relationships. And engaging with people, not in terms of, you can still participate politically and have your own opinions and all that, as long as you don't interfere with other people's opinions and rights and so on. And vote for whoever you want, as long as you honor and respect our institutions of democracy, right? Because otherwise, we're undermining the very thing that we value so much. But then also, the other piece is, of course, when you work with somebody, next to somebody building a house, a Habitat for Humanity project, for example, or clothing drive or a food drive, more often than not, when I've done this, nobody asks me, what party are you from? What political party? We just do these things together, and we actually enjoy contributing to our community. We get to talk about a lot of other things, and most of the time has nothing to do with political parties. As to what kind of food you like, or what music you like, or where did you travel, where's your family from, and getting to know each other, right? And so I am glad that you mentioned that just now, that the sustaining these relationships is an important part of keeping that glue. Right?
Well, and I think I'll be quick here. There's two other important parts of that too, is that when it does, then when you're doing these sorts of things, when it does come time for maybe the more challenging political stuff that's happening, you're more likely to see that other person as like, hey, look, they're not a bad, I may disagree with them. It's not a bad guy or bad individual. And I think that matters, right? It kind of puts us all on an even, level of citizenship. And then the other kind of piece of it is just, also pulling us out of our political identities, right? There's more to us than just that. And so we talked about this, is that, having this was the Nation of Joiners chapter a little bit, right? Having
Yep.
a community, kind of identity a little bit outside of just,
Right.
politics. And those were things
Absolutely.
that I think were prevalent in our prior upswings, not to take from prevalent. And I think, trying to find, ways we can do that in a healthy way.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Andrew, it was getting close to the end, and we do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So, thank you again for your insights. Now, I want to turn it over to the audience. Of course, we have about 15 minutes, I would say, to ask questions. So, I want the audience to please write down your questions in the chat room, and my colleague Zoya Ali will gather the questions, and then she'll be asking you, Andrew, sharing the questions with you. Andrew, so I'll turn it over to Zoya.
Thank you, Val. We have our first question from Steve Masiada from the Louvre Institute. This was in regards to your conversation about voting and voter engagement. Steve asks, isn't there a danger, though, of the infusion of negative partisanship into civic engagement as described here? Engagement in opposition to some nebulous quote-unquote other. How do we address that?
Yeah,
that's a good one.
it is a good one. I think may not be a perfect answer here, but I think this is why, maybe going back to our most recent point, Val, and hopefully, and sorry if I don't capture all of this, but I think my personal feeling is that this is why the kind of the type of things we would do as the nation of joiners matters so much, right? The more we can kind of build healthy kind of community identities where we bump into different people, right? Outside of, the extreme kind of forms of partisanship. And this is also why kind of the national conversation matters, right? When the national conversation is caustic like this, it kind of impedes on the local community. So I think my first instinct is that I think part of the solution there is, finding ways for us to weave better forms of kind of community and social engagement, right? Not to pull, it's not just, kind of bowling leads. It's a whole set of stuff, right? From kind of religious affiliation to just community, volunteerism, things like Rotary. And I think, together, many of those things, participating in those sorts of ways tend to promote kind of healthy, forms of social capital. So I think that's part of it. And then, quite frankly, I think the other part of it is that the national conversation has got to get better, right?
And I mean, there's always the challenge, right? That everything could have a bad or a positive or a negative side. You can have a gun, and the gun can be used to protect somebody's life, like police officers. But sometimes some police officers have used the gun irresponsibly and killed, some people. So I think with the same thing with free associations and civic engagement, that there's going to be some people who will be engaged in that way and do demonstrations that promote racial bias and white supremacy, and democracy allows for that. So there's always going to be that, I think, and I'm not sure. It's a complex question, I think, to address. Do we deny those people the right to articulate their views? I mean.
Can I also or just add one more element to this too? Is I think we just a generality is that, and I think many people on this call will already know this, is that just those who are a little bit more, and I don't know if extreme is the right word, but those who find both on all sides of persuasions, right, who tend to be more committed and maybe extreme in their views tend to be a little bit more engaged, right? In a lot of ways, and outspoken and organized. And I think I may not put it this way, I think there's an interesting question is why I think about, things like, like religious affiliation and Rotary and other forms of public service, because I think it's the middle, the important, again, it's a big middle, a big kind of non-extreme middle that has kind of dropped out of participation, and getting, more participation, I think will help to balance, there's always going to be some, again, like the dark side, I think that was it, right? The dark side of capital, which social capital, those sorts of things. So, yeah.
Great. The next question, Zoya?
The next question is from Stephen Armstrong. He asks, is it naive to think that the national discourse on voting, civic engagement, will improve in the near future, or is that realistic?
Excellent question.
I think it's going to take time, and I think it's one thing I'm thinking about as kind of an extension of. I'm not trying to be selfish here, but it's a good question, and I think the extent to which the electorate and voters and others can make it important, right, and make it relevant is to help kind of drive the importance of it. I think. And forgive me to everyone, there was more that went into this book than just Robert Putnam, but I did just finish The Upswing, and there was a lesson from the progressive era where it wasn't one person driving the ship, right? There was a kind of a groundswell of different efforts that kind of contributed, and my hope is that there's a lot of and I'm learning about just the broad network of folks who are trying to kind of do positive things to turn the tide here. And I think, I don't think it's going to be immediate, but I think the more that efforts like Everyday Democracy and others can build upon one another, that it can introduce these other elements into the national conversation. Right. So that's my optimistic hope. But I'm also learning that's not going to happen in maybe.
Oh yeah, it will take time, and we at Everyday Democracy recognize that, and we build capacity, we build skills for people to facilitate conversations, and to have honest conversations that are inclusive and respect other people's opinions and build relationships and trust. So the more that happens across the country, that could be a catalyst for the kind of change that we hope we'll achieve. Another question. As we conclude this event, again, thank you, Andrew. Please let's give Andrew some applause for joining us today. Thank you.
Okay.
And before we adjourn, I want to again thank the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Connecticut Humanities for funding this program. And also, I want to thank our co-sponsors, Connecticut Civic Ambassadors program, and my colleagues at Everyday Democracy who were part of putting this event together. Thank you, Sandy, Zoya, Agnes, and Elena. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for participating. I also want to ask all of you for a favor. In the chat room, please click the link to a short survey that we would like for all of you to complete online. It will take less than 5 minutes, and it will help us to gauge what you've learned and gained from this event. It will help us plan future events better. And as you do that, I also want to invite those of you who are not Connecticut Civic Ambassadors and would like to be, to learn more about it, how you can become a Civic Ambassador. And Zoya or Sandy will be putting the link to that as well. It will take you to the website with a lot of information and also an online membership form. And then finally, next week, you'll be receiving an email with the link to the video of this event. Hopefully next week, because it takes time to edit it and so on. And so please complete the survey, and if you get a chance, click on the other link for the Civic Ambassadors. And once again, I just want to say, Andrew, I had a chance to meet you and talk to you several times, and we've gotten really this great conversation going. We could go on for another hour, I'm sure. But I want to thank you because you've touched on so many different aspects of why civic engagement, and it's important how important it is to renew our civic life so that we can make our communities and our democracy a better place for all. So again, thank you so much, Andrew, and thank all of you for joining us. I wish you a safe weekend and safe and wonderful holidays. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Val. It's great to be with you.
Take care.
Thank you very much.